In my previous episode about a proposed NASA SpaceX Mars mission, I talked about a lot of the basics, especially in situ resource utilization and other important factors that would be necessary to make a mission like that a success. However, I also talked about another opinion that had been produced by European Space Agency officials suggesting that SpaceX's plan to get to Mars, to put human beings there, and to return them safely is deeply flawed. And here's a quick overview of what they had to say. Quote, SpaceX has published over various media conceptual information for its reusable Starship to enable human exploration missions to the Martian surface by the end of the decade. The technological and human challenges associated with these plans are daunting. Such a mission at that distance would require excellent system reliability and in-situ resource utilization on a grand scale, especially to produce propellant. The plans contain little details, however, and have not yet been reviewed concerning their feasibility. In this paper that they produced, by the way, which is entitled About Feasibility of SpaceX's Human Exploration Mars Mission Scenario with Starship, we show significant technological gaps in these plans. Based on estimates and extrapolated data, a mass model as needed to fulfill SpaceX's plans could not be reproduced, and the subsequent trajectory optimization showed that the current plans do not yield a return flight opportunity due to a too large system mass. In other words, these folks are arguing that Starship and its payload on a return flight, even with minimal payload on board, is not going to have enough fuel and enough available Delta V to get back to Earth. The paper goes on to say, quote, furthermore, significant gaps exist in relevant technologies, such as power supply for the Martian surface, and it is unlikely that these gaps can be closed until the end of the decade. But they make some recommendations as well, some remedies that might make all of this possible. But the most important thing is, are they right? Did they actually analyze SpaceX's plan and Starship's capabilities in sufficient detail to be taken seriously? Does SpaceX and Elon Musk's Mars mission objectives, do their ambitions have a fatal flaw that need to be resolved before we even think about colonizing the red planet? All of this and more coming at you on The Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to The Angry Astronaut. First of all, I'd like to thank Anton Nim, my latest Patreon supporter. He's been a long-time supporter of the channel, but now has joined on Patreon. Thanks so much. Welcome to the family. If you'd like to join him and get all the benefits that come with Patreon membership, including exclusive videos, Discord membership, early release videos, that sort of thing, all the details are in the description. Okay, so this paper that I'm going to be quoting from extensively and also analyzing seeks to answer the following very basic questions about the proposed SpaceX mission. First of all, is the mass information provided by SpaceX plausible? In other words, could something as heavy as Starship make a journey to Mars and then make it back? Is the propellant mass as given by SpaceX plausible for the given mission scenario? Is the time of flight aimed at by SpaceX plausible? And once again, SpaceX is talking about 90-day timeframes right now, not 6 months anymore. Apparently, they're really looking for some serious performance out of those Raptor engines. And then finally, what is the energy need for in-situ resource utilization, or hereafter referred to as ISRU, activities on the Martian surface, and how can it be satisfied? So some very, very basic questions. And if the SpaceX plan doesn't quite measure up, then there are some significant issues that need to be resolved. So first of all, here's some fundamentals in terms of the proposed mass of Starship. And we need to leave Super Heavy out of this because the assumption is that Super Heavy delivers Starship up to low Earth orbit. Then Starship is completely refueled there with a propellant depot that is refueled by multiple tankers, and then a fully refueled Starship makes the journey to Mars. Once it arrives on Mars, then propellant is manufactured in situ on the Martian surface to completely refuel Starship again in order to make the trip home. The mass of Starship itself, including a 20% margin, and by the way, this is information provided by SpaceX themselves, is 100 metric tons, and that's just the weight of Starship itself. In addition to that, you have the payload mass. Presumably, that is also 100 metric tons. Now, the maximum permissible perigee velocity on a Mars landing trajectory, in other words, the delta V required to get from low Earth orbit to land on Mars while using the Martian atmosphere to decelerate. We're not talking about entering Mars orbit. We're just talking about getting from low Earth orbit to the Martian surface. That's 7.5 kilometers per second worth of delta V. That holds up, by the way. That is approximately what's going to be required delta V-wise in order to reach the Martian surface. Now, going back, this is where we have a problem. Getting all the way back to an Earth landing trajectory and using Earth's atmosphere to decelerate once you arrive. In other words, don't have enough fuel left to enter orbit. You just have to use the atmosphere to slow you down. This is 12.5 kilometers per second going back. And the reason for that is Starship needs to overcome Mars gravity as well as the delta V necessary to go from Mars escape velocity to get back to Earth. So in other words, that original 7.5 kilometers per second needed to get to Mars, plus another 5 kilometers per second to escape Mars gravity in order to get back. And I kind of see where they're coming from at this point, because that's a lot of delta V for even a fully refueled Starship to accomplish, especially since you don't have Super Heavy at your disposal. Keep in mind that Super Heavy plus Starship is barely enough to overcome Earth's gravity of a little bit over 9 kilometers per second worth of delta V, let alone 12.5. But let's not get to those problems just yet. Also, a lot of analysis is done in terms of the mass requirements for Starship in order to get, say, a dozen astronauts to Mars. We're not talking 100 here. We're just talking a dozen. And a great deal of time and effort was invested in coming up with these calculations, something that I'm not going to go over with you in terms of all the details and formula. I'm just going to share the final results, and if you want to go ahead and analyze the actual numbers and how they came up with it, I've got the paper linked in the description. So, first of all, we need to talk about Starship structure. What is necessary to actually build an interplanetary spaceship? Well, SpaceX allots 100 metric tons for the structure of Starship. They don't really say what that's going to be made up of, but these folks did a lot of research to come up with their own conclusions. First of all, radiation shielding. You need to have sufficient shielding around the entire spacecraft in order to protect the astronauts from potential solar storms and just the cosmic rays and solar radiation that exists in interplanetary space. This is one of the heaviest parts of the equation, simply because you need lots and lots of mass in order to accommodate the necessary radiation shielding, which would probably be a layer of water insulating the ship, which, by the way, could be used for other purposes as well. But 30 metric tons is allotted to that. Then you have meteoroid shielding. That's another 22.1 metric tons. Then the structure of the ship itself. need a structure that's resilient enough to support 100 tons worth of payload in Martian gravity. That's 40.7 metric tons. And then the heat shield is another 11 metric tons. And that, of course, is assuming that the heat shield doesn't require all the extra ablative layers that SpaceX has been using lately in order to carry out successful atmospheric re-entries thus far in the tests we've seen. Then you have life support, thermal control, accommodation, that sort of thing, about 3.6 metric tons for that. They even allot things like radiation vests, 0.3 metric tons, solar arrays for power, 2.1 metric tons, batteries, 9.5 metric tons. Then the propulsion system, 12.1 tons for the Raptor engines, 20.3 tons for the main tanks, and 5.5 tons for the helium tanks necessary in order to make the propulsion system work. And then the crew and consumables at minimum for 12 people is 106.3 metric tons. Now, I hear a whole bunch of you calling bullshit on this, so let me go ahead and give you how they came up with these figures. They did a lot of analysis on this, so we'll just go ahead and break it down. We're looking at an average of 80 kilograms per astronaut, just in terms of the mass of the human beings. The spacesuit for inside, just inside, is 30 kilograms. If you need an EVA spacesuit, that's 60 kilograms. All of this is pretty minor, though. Then you have some crew preference items. Let's assume that they restrict it to 10 kilograms per person, 5 kilograms per person for crew operational items, crew safety items of 10 kilograms per person, and crew accommodation items of 5 kilograms per person. All that very minor. We're looking at 200 kilograms per person for just the basics. Then you're adding 100 kilograms worth of scientific payload per person. Again, I think that's very minor considering that there's got to be a lot of scientific work done on a Mars mission. But here's where most of the mass comes from. The oxygen. Now keep in mind, yes, there is going to be recycling involved in any advanced life support system, but even with a 95% efficiency reclamation rate, even if it's that good, it's still looking at 0.84 kilograms per person per day worth of oxygen. The food, of course, is not going to be recycled, at least I hope not. That's 2.4 kilograms per day. Potable water with a 90% recycling rate, 2.5 kilograms per day. Then hygiene water with an 85% efficiency reclamation rate, that's 1 kilogram per day. Then hygiene items of 0.5 kilograms per day, and clothing at 0.5 kilograms per day, because keep in mind, you're not going to be doing any laundry on board. That would require way too much water, so you need enough clothing in order to accommodate this journey of 180 days. Now, I know SpaceX keeps talking about a 90-day transfer rate, and perhaps that's possible, but if you're going to go faster, that requires more fuel and more delta V. The more delta V you use, the more fuel you're going to use while accomplishing the journey. But they did a number of interesting estimates in terms of how the time could be shaved down a little bit, the transit time that is, for different windows of launch opportunities. 2029 is not actually all that good. Earth and Mars are not going to get all that close to one another during that particular conjunction. There's a better Earth-Mars transfer time in 2033 that theoretically, assuming everything went right and you burned a fair amount of delta V in the process, you could shave the journey down to maybe around 120 days instead of 180, which would, of course, significantly reduce the consumables. In 2035, things get even better, with a journey taking as little as 110 days. And if you do all of that, then it reduces the system mass down to perhaps around 150 metric tons instead of the 210.5 metric tons that appears to be necessary for 12 people for a 180-day journey. Now, of course, if you reduce the crew size down to 6 instead of 12, that would make a difference as well. There's ways to play with this in order to make it a little bit more doable, but nevertheless, it's still going to be extremely challenging. Now, the return flights, that's where things get a lot more difficult. But before we talk about the frankly unachievable Delta V requirements, we also need to talk about the amount of consumables that need to be produced in situ on Mars in order to supply a 12-person crew for 500 days, the amount of time that would elapse before the next conjunction event with Earth and Mars, and then the amount of consumables necessary to safely get them back. The fuel is, of course, the biggest issue. We're talking 940 metric tons worth of liquid oxygen and 260 metric tons of liquid methane need to be resupplied as propellant for the inbound trip. Now, assuming that all you're taking back with you is the crew and the consumables necessary to keep them alive for 180 days, this is 1,263 metric tons plus 158 kilograms. Yeah, they calculated this down to the kilogram. And of course, virtually all of this is going to have to be supplied by in situ resource utilization. Let me tell you something, that is a very, very tall order. Now, we have the necessary technologies to create methane and oxygen, just about everything that is necessary in order to manufacture the necessary propellant for a return trip to Earth. But all of these things are going to require a lot of energy and a lot of time. Now, you can manufacture methane on Mars via the Sabatier method. As a matter of fact, Elon Musk talks about this, utilizing water and CO2. All you need is carbon and hydrogen. And the Sabatier machine was actually built by a team of university students that could produce 1 kilogram of methane per day. It weighed 50 kilograms and required 700 watts of power. Now, the authors made some assumptions about improving the efficiency of such a system as it's being scaled up, but still, the requirement is absolutely staggering. In order to manufacture enough fuel in 500 days to completely replenish Starship supplies in time to get back home, that's going to require 5,107 kilograms worth of fuel per day, or 2.5 megawatts worth of power necessary in order to produce it. That is an absolutely enormous amount of energy, the kind of thing that you'd probably need a nuclear reactor for. So you would need a nuclear reactor delivered to the Martian surface, or an enormous amount of solar panels. I mean, the number of solar panels, especially on Mars, where daylight is not as bright as it is on Earth, to produce 2.5 megawatts is absolutely staggering. And by the way, this doesn't even include the power necessary for water extraction to extract the necessary hydrogen for the Sabatier method in the first place, and to mine the water ice in the first place as well. Now, of course, all of these things could be done before the explorers even arrive on the surface of the planet. Indeed, that would probably be the best thing to do, rather than risk sentencing these 12 people to a slow and agonizing death if they didn't manage to reach the deadline in 500 days. But if this is done, that means all of these things need to be done before we can even consider a Mars mission, meaning that Elon Musk's timeline of trying to do these things within the next 4, 6, 8, or even 10 years doesn't seem very realistic at all, even assuming that we had this kind of technology ready to make the journey now. And then, of course, there's the return journey issue. As I've already talked about, the delta V required to get back to Earth, if you add in the delta V expense of overcoming Mars gravity, is simply not within Starship's capabilities, not if it has to carry all the payload necessary to keep 12 people alive for 180 days. And if you reduce the transit time, it increases the delta V requirements very, very substantially, as a matter of fact. A 90-day return trajectory would require over 8 kilometers per second worth of delta V, and that doesn't include the delta V necessary to escape Mars gravity. So we're looking at over 13 kilometers per second worth of delta V overall, which is substantially more than it requires to escape Earth's gravity. And keep in mind, to get Starship, a fully loaded Starship anyway, to low Earth orbit requires only about 9.5 kilometers per second worth of delta V. So we're talking a lot more delta V than we are originally using both Super Heavy and Starship to achieve. In other words, these numbers simply don't add up. A way to reduce the delta V requirements is to extend the return trajectory tremendously. A 300-day return trajectory, for example, would cut the delta V down enormously to where a fully refueled Starship might be able to pull it off. But keep in mind the amount of consumables you would need for 12 people for a 300-day return journey. It's absolutely ridiculous. So what's the solution here? Does this paper simply say that all of this is impossible? Well, no. That's not actually the case. What this paper is suggesting is that the technology necessary to make all of this happen, at least with Starship, simply does not exist yet. For example, the consumables required for 12 people on a lengthy journey would drop off drastically if you had a 100% efficiency life support system, something that recycles all the water, all the oxygen. If you did that, then the consumables drop off tremendously, and so is the delta V required in order to push that much mass. In addition to that, the technology maturity for all the other systems, the in situ systems that are required on the Martian surface to produce the food, the propellant, and everything else that's necessary for these 12 people to survive and successfully return to Earth, all of this is at a very low level of maturity as well. And the point that this paper is trying to make is that the technology isn't there yet. We need to advance significantly, especially if we're talking about propellant production systems on Mars, a nuclear power system if that's what we end up using there. Orbital refueling is even at a low technological readiness level right now. Really, the only thing that's fairly advanced at the moment are the Raptor engines, solar arrays, perhaps the heat shield, and that's about it. Now, of course, there is one other scenario where all of this does work out a whole lot better. And that is if this mission is a one-way trip, if these 12 people have no intention of ever returning to Earth. If you remove that process out of the mission, then it becomes a lot more feasible. At the same time, of course, there is no margin for error. If these 12 people are unable to survive for any reason, there's no way they're going to be able to go home, and they're simply going to die on Mars, which would be a horrific PR disaster for SpaceX, especially if you were to make the decision to send these people knowing that there's no way that they could get back even under the most extreme of circumstances. So am I saying, like so many other experts are saying, that there's just so much technology that still needs to be developed that going to Mars anytime in the near future is just not realistic? Have I turned into a complete naysayer? Well, no. One of the biggest problems with this mission, one of the biggest challenges, is the fact that we are trying to get something as big as Starship and as heavy as Starship in its payload out to Mars, and to get it all the way back as well. might be better to use something this big for one-way trips just to carry supplies, equipment, vehicles, that sort of thing, and to take smaller craft that require a lot less propellant to achieve the same delta V just to bring the passengers and to bring them back safely. And how do we accomplish all of this? Well, that's going to be the topic of the last episode in this series. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. And once again, please consider supporting this channel on Patreon so I can keep bringing you this content. And also, please don't forget to support the incredible work of Hayzegrayart, whose animations you're watching right now, and also SpaceXVision, whose animations you've enjoyed earlier in this video. Please go to their YouTube channels and subscribe, and also watch these videos in their entirety because they have some incredible audio that you haven't heard here. So support them and support this channel, and thanks very much for watching again. Until next time, stay angry about space.